Hi, I wanted to make this video because I've actually come up with a pretty massive update to the Blood Surge, Corpse Explosion, Necromancer to both better fit the beta and to kind of shine a light on some of the ways they're able to more easily scale your damage output, especially against single target elites and bosses, where a build that is based around two different skills that scale with monster density typically runs into some issues. Now, a lot of people recommended a ton of different changes to the build, which I definitely appreciate. Thank you so much for commenting those in the last video. But I wanted to touch on the choices that we have made, and then a little bit of refuting some of the options that people are giving me, just for a personal playstyle standpoint, and hopefully to also educate a little bit about some of the issues that you might run into, especially if you are a bit newer on the build. So first, I wanted to talk about the skills themselves and what we have ultimately changed on this build. The skill tree has become pretty pared down at this point. We are realistically only using 3 abilities for all intents and purposes, and I've redirected some of the power of the build away from trying to scale our primary damage sources and instead make up again for some of the shortcomings that the build has, which is most namely just against big single target monsters, because you're not able to really generate enough corpses to be able to keep your corpse explosion domino going, especially if the boss doesn't summon minions. And Blood Surge also scales with damage according to how many monsters have been hit. So putting those two things together, where did we end up? Well, you'll notice that I had a bunch of skeleton warriors, and it's no secret. We've ended up picking up Skeleton Warrior Mastery. This is easily one of the strongest scaling skill options per point that is available in the tree at this point. I have yet to find an aspect that actually scales my corpse explosion damage directly, and I've only found indirect means of actually scaling our overall damage output in a pure flat damage increase level. I have a couple options that increase my critical strike chance and make me deal more damage to unstoppable foes, but I just haven't found a corpse explosion does X times more damage. So Skeletal Warrior Mastery that just says your warriors now deal 45% more damage was a surprisingly powerful jump in single target damage output, and the ability to use these skeletons as opposed to relying on the curses that we were before gives us more options for scaling our corpse generation factor, and I'll touch on that in just a quick second. A lot of people are asking me why I wasn't using Decompose, and Decompose is trying to solve for a similar issue. Decompose says that it'll generate a corpse every 2.5 seconds, as long as you are actively channeling Decompose, and that's where my issue with the skill runs into. Often in a boss fight, and also with large elite monsters, you run into the problem where they either drop an AoE shadow type ability on you, which literally cancels your ability to target, stopping your channel, or you need to move out of the way. And in these cases, Decompose becomes less consistent than even Reap's 5-second cooldown, because I do a single animation with Reap and I get a single corpse. I do that in the middle of kind of circling through the rest of my build, cycling through the rest of my build, and movement. So realistically, I only ever found an opportunity to be proactively making a corpse once every 5 seconds, and the additional benefit to Reap is that it occurs on the moment that you use it. So while it says once every 5 seconds, it's at the moment of use that cooldown starts and you've already generated a corpse. 5 seconds after that, you're able to generate another corpse. So for the first cycle, you're actually generating 2 corpses per 5 seconds, which is exactly what you would get from Decompose, generating 1 corpse at the end of 2.5 second periods. That's why I personally do not like Decompose, because I don't think on average it turns out to be more corpses per second generation, unless you're in a perfect situation where you can be channeling the entire time, and then you're not casting Corpse Explosion. So that's all I got there. I don't want to beat a dead horse into a bush, but you get what I'm trying to say. For the build, we're still using Acolyte's Reap. We're still going to be maxing out Blood Surge, going down into Paranormal Blood Surge. We don't worry about any of these other passives. We fully stack Corpse Explosion, going down into Plagued Corpse Explosion, because we are still using 1-point Corpse Tendrils as well as Plagued Corpse Tendrils. And then with the 1 point in Grim Harvest and the 2 points into Fueled by Death, that is a minor way of us scaling all of our overall damage whenever we're using Corpse Explosion. And then the 3 points into Skeleton warrior mastery. Now, here's the problem. You'll notice I'm not using mages, I'm not using golems, and that's because there's a bug in the beta right now that makes them scale unfairly. So I'm playing the build without them as if that scaling were in place. And let me just show you that. You'll notice that I have the 3 points here, so this is 45% additional damage on my skeletal warriors. I do not have skeletal mages up, and I do not have golem mastery up. And let's go look at my stats, because that tells a slightly different story. You'll see here that my damage with warriors, my damage with mages, my damage with golems are all at 45%, which should be impossible. If I go and take a single point out of skeletal mastery, and then I go back to my stats, you'll notice that it now says that I have 30% damage with all three of them. So the funny part here is that if I then go put a point into skeletal mage mastery, and I go look at my stats again, you'll see that my skeletal mages are not doing more damage like you would expect. For whatever reason, skeletal mage mastery, golem mastery, and skeletal warrior mastery are all bugged. This skill and this skill do nothing, whereas this skill scales all of your summons damage all the way, and that is clearly not intended. So when we go look at our Book of the Dead, you'll see a pretty interesting story, but we are using skirmishers. I actually don't think that we have any problems with generating corpses at this point, and our single target damage is so much better that I'd rather enhance our single target damage as opposed to increase our corpse generation. If you needed more corpses, you could strictly go back to Reaper with the chance of generating a corpse whenever they hit, but skirmisher damage seems to outperform Reaper damage in the situations where the Reapers actually take too long to hit a monster and they either move or you end up killing them first. The skirmishers are literally just doing more DPS per second. The difference here is I'm choosing to go with an additional skirmisher. So right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's because we also have an aspect that gives us +2 additional warriors. But without that, the additional skirmisher is theoretically a 25% damage increase. Whereas the when you crit, they will then crit and do more damage would work pretty well if we were able to scale our own crit chance. Just to show you that, my critical strike chance is at 11%. So I figured if I'm critting at 11% of the time and they would gain a small 50% damage increase on a crit damage that they would do naturally, that seems like a smaller damage increase than just increasing the number of skeletons. That's real napkin math. I haven't sat down and crunched the numbers fully, but that's just my intuition at this point. I do think once you have a higher crit chance, that going with the crit enhancement here would absolutely do a lot better. Then, because I didn't want to be receiving benefits from my skeleton mages and golems that would be unrealistic to your gameplay experience, especially once the game goes live, I've sacrificed our skeleton mages and our golem. I am using the you deal increased damage to vulnerable monsters. Quite often we're applying vulnerable because we're often using corpse tendrils to be able to apply vulnerable to, again, elite and boss monsters, since they are the only places where we actually run into issues. Everything else just gets one tapped by either blood surge or our corpse explosion domino. So this is another way of scaling our damage against the monsters that we have the hardest time scaling our damage. And then for the golem, we are sacrificing just getting us that increased attack speed. It's good. It helps us to generate reap corpses faster to minimize the animation duration, and then in general just speeds up our casting. So I definitely think this is the best way of kitting out the character right now without getting, again, unfair buffs from bugs on skills that will not be there when the game releases. And just to talk about the ways I've kind of kitted out my character, because we have found some aspects that make the build a lot better, and I'll just quickly troll through them. Here we have exploiters. This says that we have increased crowd control duration, period. And also we deal 50% increased damage to monsters who are unstoppable. I still need to test whether or not world bosses and dungeon bosses are considered unstoppable 100% of the time, or if they merely cannot be crowd controlled, which are two very different things. And once I do that testing and find a way of reproducing it, I will gladly show it to people. You'll notice that this is still my barbarian helmet. I literally haven't found a helmet with better stats on it yet for the Necromancer, and we're just still using this one because higher armor is better damage negation. We're using maximum skeletons are increased by 2. Again, just easy scalability with our warriors, especially with that 45% damage increase from our skill tree. We have our skeletons gain 25% additional damage after being alive for 10 seconds. My skeletons just don't die. The 45% increase to their maximum life is more than good enough, and whenever you need to, you can use the activated ability to heal them a bit if you ever have downtime and you don't need the corpses for damage. This one is actually not for their survivability at all, but whenever we damage an elite, we will gain barrier, and that is so important because we have a damage scaler when we have barrier active. On the boots, we have the unstoppable will give you movement speed. It's just nice. We don't currently have a way of generating unstoppable. I do want to get the aspect for blood mist that makes it so that it pops your corpse explosion for you, because I'm pretty sure that this should scale with it, because that gives you unstoppable. So I'm just hoping to test that out once I have the other aspect. On the amulet, we're using consuming a corpse increases our core skill damage. This is another way of scaling against elite monsters, because if we're only generating a few corpses every fight, this will go a long way to help our blood surge damage, which should be overpowered whenever we cast it at intelligent places because we got enough charges up. So just another way of dealing with the issues that the build runs into for overall damage scalability. Then lastly, we have increased critical strike chance against monsters that are injured, and while I'm healthy, I have greater crowd control duration. I'm healthy the vast majority of the time. The blood surge helps us to stay healed. Picking up blood orbs is another great way to stay healed, and this just means that when corpse tendrils comes down, we gain a lot more crowd control duration, as well as stacking that with our helmet, so that we're able to have vulnerable applied as well as slow and stun for the maximum length of time to increase corpse explosion damage against single targets. You're picking up on it. For the weapon, we also picked up probably one of the best damage scalers in the beta right now, which is your skills deal up to a maximum amount of damage equal to how much resource you have on cast. That's another reason why Fueled by Death here, or I'm sorry, Grim Harvest, this is Fueled by Death, but Grim Harvest is so good because corpse exploding will get us back the essence that we need, meaning that when we cast our next blood surge, which is going to hit twice, it's almost certainly going to be at the maximum benefit of 62% damage. Now, I did test whether or not this would make corpse explosion just do more damage, because corpse explosion doesn't use resource. It looks like this doesn't apply to it. So I'm going to assume that just based off of that single test, this will only work for skills that specifically use resource, as opposed to every skill which does not use or in fact gains resource. But just another great flat modifier. We are using critical strike damage versus crowd control enemies because we have the increased critical strike chance from right here once a monster is injured, where they're typically crowd controlled as well. And this is just a way of closing out fights faster, again, especially against elites and bosses. So that was a lot of information. I hope that this goes a long way to show how we've shored up some of the issues with the build. Once I have the entirety of the build put back together, I will do another build video where I do a much simpler explanation of what I just said here, as well as gameplay. I'm looking for that blood mist aspect. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this went to answer a lot of the questions that you might have had, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.